On a bone-chilling October morning in 1985, when autumn fog clung to the Pennsylvania mountains like ghostly fingers, construction worker Jake Morrison kicked what he thought was a rusted oil drum buried beneath decades of fallen leaves. The metallic clang echoed through the silent pine forest surrounding the abandoned Millfield mining company, a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The drum didn't budge. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow despite the 40-degree air, his breath forming small clouds as he called over to his partner. "Hey, Danny, got something here that ain't moving." The planned construction of a new highway had brought their crew to this forgotten corner of the Allegheny Mountains, where rusted equipment and collapsed mine shafts dotted the landscape like scars from a different era. Danny Rodriguez approached, his hard hat tilted at an angle that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. The discovery of old mining debris had already delayed their project by 2 weeks, and the foreman was breathing down their necks. "Probably just more junk from the old operation," he muttered, but something in Jake's expression made him pause. The drum wasn't like the others they'd found. While most of the abandoned equipment bore the telltale orange rust of decades exposed to Pennsylvania weather, this container seemed almost preserved, protected, as if someone had taken care to ensure it remained sealed against time and the elements. Jake's crowbar caught the edge of the lid, and the sound of metal scraping against metal sent a murder of crows exploding from the surrounding trees. The lid resisted at first, then gave way with a wet, sucking sound that neither man would ever forget. The smell hit them like a physical blow. Danny stumbled backward, his breakfast threatening to make a reappearance, while Jake stood frozen, staring into the dark interior of the container. What he saw would transform a routine construction job into the most complex criminal investigation Pennsylvania had seen in decades. Nested inside, wrapped in what appeared to be heavy plastic sheeting, were human remains. Not one body, but two. An adult and what appeared to be a small child, positioned as if someone had taken care to arrange them, with a twisted kind of tenderness. Detective Margaret Chen received the call at 9:47 a.m. while reviewing case files in her cramped office at the Pennsylvania State Police Barracks in Somerset. 28 years old and the only Asian American detective in a department that still operated like it was 1955, she'd learned to navigate the delicate balance between proving herself and avoiding the cases nobody else wanted. This wouldn't be one of those cases. "We got something unusual out in Millfield," Sergeant Bob Kowalski's voice crackled through the phone. Construction crew found human remains. Multiple victims. Margaret grabbed her coat and notebook, already mentally cataloging the equipment she'd need. Millfield was a ghost town. Literally, abandoned when the mining company pulled out in 1969, leaving behind only empty houses and the kind of silence that seemed to absorb sound. If someone had chosen that location to dispose of bodies, they'd picked well. The drive through the mountains gave her time to think. Multiple victims suggested either a family tragedy or something far more sinister. The remote location pointed toward the latter. By the time she pulled up to the crime scene, yellow tape had already cordoned off an area roughly 50 feet in diameter around the discovery site. The county coroner, Dr. Emily Hartman, was already on scene, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun that had served her through 30 years of examining Pennsylvania's unexplained deaths. She looked up as Margaret approached, her expression grave. "2 victims, Dr. Hartman said without preamble. Adult female, appears to be in her 20s or 30s. Child, probably between 5 and 10 years old. Hard to tell gender at this point." She paused, pulling off her latex gloves. "They've been here a while, Margaret. Years, possibly." Margaret knelt beside the container, studying the scene with the methodical attention that had earned her reputation as one of the department's most thorough investigators. The plastic wrapping was thick, industrial grade, the kind used in construction or manufacturing, not something a casual killer would have easy access to. "Any identification?" "None visible. Whoever did this was careful." Dr. Hartman's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much human cruelty. But there's something else. This container, it's not from the mining operation. Too new, wrong type. Someone brought this here specifically. The implications settled over the crime scene like the mountain fog that never quite lifted from the hollows. This wasn't a crime of passion or a family murder-suicide gone wrong. Someone had planned this, executed it with precision, and chosen this specific location for disposal. Margaret stood, her eyes scanning the surrounding forest. Millfield sat in a valley surrounded by thousands of acres of state game lands and abandoned mining claims. A person could hide a dozen bodies out here, and they might never be found. The question that would keep her awake for months was already forming. If this killer had been so careful, so methodical, why stop at 2 victims? The forensics team arrived from Harrisburg just after noon, their white van looking alien against the autumn landscape. Margaret watched them work with the precision of archaeologists, photographing every angle, cataloging every piece of evidence before the remains were carefully extracted from their metal tomb. Crime scene photographer Tommy Walsh moved around the site like a dancer, capturing images that would later be studied frame by frame for clues the naked eye might miss. Each flash of his camera seemed to freeze time, preserving moments that families somewhere might be desperately hoping to understand. Detective Chen. Tommy's voice carried a note of uncertainty that made Margaret look up from her notebook. You might want to see this. He was crouched beside a second container, partially buried about 20 feet from the first discovery. This one was smaller, older, and bore the orange patina of long exposure to the elements. Margaret's blood chilled as she realized what this meant. How many? She asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. At least one more, Tommy replied, his camera already clicking away. Possibly 2 based on the size. The second container held the remains of what appeared to be another child, even younger than the first. The preservation was poorer, suggesting this victim had been here longer, much longer. Margaret stepped back from the scene, her mind racing. 3 victims, possibly 4, spanning what could be years or even decades. The remote location, the careful disposal, the industrial containers. This wasn't the work of someone acting on impulse. This was a serial killer, and based on the evidence, one who had been operating in Pennsylvania longer than anyone had realized. The radio crackled to life on her belt. Dispatch was calling with a priority message that would change everything. All units, be advised we have a missing persons report from 90. Mother and 2 children from Philadelphia area last seen traveling through central Pennsylvania. Description matches potential victims at Millfield site. Margaret felt the first piece of the puzzle click into place, followed immediately by the sinking realization of how massive this investigation was about to become. Somewhere families had been waiting 3 years for answers about their missing loved one, and if her growing suspicions were correct, this killer hadn't stopped with these victims. By evening, the crime scene had transformed into a small city of law enforcement personnel. FBI agents had arrived from Pittsburgh, their black SUVs parked alongside state police cruisers, and the coroner's van. Portable lights cast harsh shadows through the trees, turning the peaceful forest into something from a nightmare. Margaret found herself sitting in her car, reviewing the preliminary reports by the dome light. The missing persons case from 1982 involved Lisa Patterson, age 26, and her 2 daughters, Emma, 7, and Sophie, 4. They'd left Philadelphia to visit Lisa's sister in Pittsburgh, but never arrived. The family had assumed they'd had car trouble or decided to stay somewhere overnight. When days turned to weeks with no contact, Philadelphia police had opened a missing persons case, but with no evidence of foul play and no body, the investigation had eventually gone cold. The timeline fit perfectly. The condition of the remains, the age estimates from Dr. Hartman, even the description of the victims, everything pointed to the Patterson family. But questions remained that made Margaret's stomach clench with dread. If these were the Pattersons, where was their car? How had they ended up in the remote mountains of central Pennsylvania? And most importantly, who had killed them with such methodical precision. Special Agent David Reeves from the FBI's Philadelphia field office knocked on her window, his badge visible in the dim light. Margaret rolled down the window, letting in the cold night air and the distant sound of generators powering the crime scene lights. "Detective Chen, I understand you're the primary on this case." His voice carried the clipped efficiency of federal law enforcement, but his eyes showed genuine concern. "We need to talk." Margaret stepped out of her car, closing her notebook. "What do you have?" "3 similar cases in Pennsylvania and Ohio over the past decade. Families disappearing while traveling. Found years later in remote locations, always in industrial containers." Agent Reeves paused, letting the implications sink in. "We think we're dealing with someone who's been doing this for a very long time." The pieces were starting to form a picture that Margaret wished she couldn't see. A killer who targeted families, who had access to industrial disposal methods, and who knew the remote areas of Pennsylvania well enough to hide bodies for years. Someone with patience, planning ability, and a level of organization that suggested they weren't finished. "There's something else," Agent Reeves continued. "We've been tracking missing persons reports along major highways between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. In the past 15 years, we've identified at least 6 families that fit the pattern. Traveling with children, last seen in this general area, never found." Margaret felt the weight of the case settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. They weren't just investigating 3 or 4 murders. They were potentially looking at one of Pennsylvania's most prolific serial killers, someone who had been operating undetected for over a decade. The radio crackled again with another update that sent chills down her spine. "Additional containers located. Estimate 4 to 6 more potential burial sites in the immediate area." As Margaret walked back toward the crime scene, the portable lights creating a harsh artificial day in the forest, she realized that what they'd found in Millfield was just the beginning. Somewhere out there, a killer was watching the news coverage, seeing the FBI vehicles and state police activity, and deciding whether to run or find new hunting grounds. The question that would drive the investigation for months to come was already forming in her mind. In a case this complex, with so many victims and so much time elapsed, would they be able to catch the killer before he struck again? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, and in a way that would turn Margaret's understanding of the case completely upside down. 3 days after the initial discovery, the Millfield site had become a carefully orchestrated excavation that resembled an archaeological dig more than a crime scene. Margaret Chen stood at the edge of what the FBI had designated as Grid Zone C, watching as cadaver dogs worked methodically through the forest, their handlers following behind with GPS units to mark every potential site. The November morning air carried the scent of decomposing leaves and something else, something that made even the most experienced investigators unconsciously hold their breath. Emily Hartman had identified remains from 7 containers so far, representing at least 14 victims spanning nearly 2 decades. The oldest appeared to date back to the late. Margaret's radio crackled. "Detective Chen, we need you at the command post. Priority 1. The command post was a collection of white FEMA trailers that had been trucked in to serve as a temporary headquarters for what was now being called the Millfield Task Force. Inside the largest trailer, Agent Reeves stood before a wall covered with photographs, maps, and timelines that told a story of systematic murder spanning Pennsylvania and neighboring states. "We've got a breakthrough," Reeves said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "And a problem." Margaret poured herself coffee from the perpetually brewing pot that had become the investigation's lifeline. "Give me the breakthrough first." Reeves pointed to a cluster of red pins on a highway map. "Every disappearance follows the same pattern. Families traveling Interstate 76 between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. They stop for gas, food, or lodging, and simply vanish. No abandoned vehicles, no witnesses to abduction, nothing. Someone with intimate knowledge of the highway system," Margaret observed. "Probably someone who travels it regularly." "Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting." Reeves pulled out a thick folder labeled Restricted Access. We ran background checks on everyone with legitimate business along that corridor who would have access to industrial containers and remote disposal sites. Mining company employees, construction workers, trucking companies, salvage operations. Margaret felt the familiar tingle that preceded a major break in a case. And one name keeps appearing. Vincent Kazinski, age 47, worked for 7 different companies along the I-76 corridor over the past 20 years. Mining operations, construction firms, even a trucking company. Every job put him in position to have access to the disposal sites and the containers we've been finding. The photograph Reeves handed her showed a man of medium height with thinning brown hair and the kind of unremarkable features that would blend into any crowd. But his eyes held something that made Margaret's skin crawl, a flatness that suggested the absence of something essential. Where is he now? That's the problem. Reeves's expression darkened. Vincent Kazinski quit his last job 3 weeks ago. Told his supervisor he was moving to Florida for health reasons. No forwarding address, no contact information. He disappeared 2 days before the construction crew found the first container. The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. Their killer knew they'd been discovered. He'd had a 3-week head start to run, destroy evidence, or worse, continue killing in a new location where investigators wouldn't think to look. The task force meeting that afternoon brought together law enforcement representatives from 6 states, each carrying files on missing families that might be connected to the Millfield killer. The trailer was packed beyond capacity, the air thick with tension and the accumulated frustration of unsolved cases. Detective Ray Morrison from Ohio State Police spread photos across the table. Toledo, 1983. The Brennan family, mother, father, 2 kids, disappeared while driving to visit relatives in Pennsylvania. Never found their car, never found them. Lieutenant Sarah Webb from West Virginia added her own grim contribution. Wheeling, 1985. Single mother with a 6-year-old daughter. Last seen at a truck stop near the Pennsylvania border. The pattern was undeniable. For nearly 20 years, families had been vanishing along a corridor of highways that connected the major cities of the Northeast. Local jurisdictions had investigated each case individually, but without a centralized database or communication system, no one had recognized the systematic nature of the disappearances. Margaret studied the timeline Agent Reeves had constructed. "Look at the gaps," she said, pointing to periods where no disappearances were recorded. 1974 to 1976, nothing. 1979 to 1981, nothing. Then another gap from 1983 to 9. Prison time, suggested Detective Morrison. Or he was working different routes, Agent Reeves replied. We're checking employment records, but Kazinski seems to have been very good at covering his tracks. Dr. Rebecca Norton, the FBI's behavioral analyst, had been quiet throughout the meeting, taking notes and studying the crime scene photographs. When she finally spoke, her words sent a chill through the room. "This isn't just about the murders," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years studying the darkest aspects of human behavior. The careful preservation of the bodies, the family groupings, the remote but accessible locations. This killer isn't just disposing of evidence, he's creating a collection. Margaret felt her blood run cold. A collection? He's keeping them where he can visit. The industrial containers protect the remains from scavengers and weather, but they're not meant to completely destroy evidence. He wants them preserved because they have meaning to him. Dr. Norton paused, letting the implications sink in. "Gentlemen, ladies, we're not dealing with someone who kills and moves on. We're dealing with someone who has been building a personal monument to his crimes for 20 years. The room fell silent except for the hum of the portable heaters and the distant sound of excavation equipment. Margaret realized they were facing something far worse than a serial killer. They were hunting someone who viewed murder as an art form and his victims as permanent trophies. That evening, Margaret found herself alone in her motel room in Somerset, surrounded by case files and crime scene photographs. The Pine Valley Motor Lodge was the kind of place where truckers caught a few hours of sleep and traveling salesmen counted their miles, but it had become an unofficial headquarters for out-of-town investigators working the Millfield case. Her phone rang at 11:47 p.m. The caller ID showed the Pennsylvania State Police dispatcher. "Detective Chen, we've got a situation. Missing family out of Harrisburg. Last seen 6 hours ago at a truck stop near Breezewood. Mother and 2 children, traveling west on ice." Margaret was already reaching for her coat. Description: Jennifer Walsh, 29, brown hair, driving a blue Honda Accord. 2 daughters, ages 4 and 7. Husband called it in when they didn't arrive at her sister's house in Pittsburgh. The details hit Margaret like electricity. Same highway, same family profile, same travel pattern. But this time, they had a fresh trail and the possibility of preventing another tragedy. "I'm 20 minutes out," Margaret said, already heading for her car. "Have all units in the area start checking rest stops, gas stations, motels, and get me Agent Reeves on the line." The drive to Breezewood took her through the heart of Pennsylvania's mountain country. Winding roads where fog clung to the valleys and deer eyes reflected in her headlights like amber stars. The truck stop where Jennifer Walsh had last been seen was one of those massive travel plazas that served as an oasis for long-haul drivers and cross-country travelers. Agent Reeves was already there when she arrived, coordinating with local police and interviewing the night manager. The blue Honda Accord sat in the parking lot like an accusation, its doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition. "No signs of struggle," Reeves reported as Margaret approached. "Security cameras show the family arriving at 9:15 p.m. Mother and children went into the convenience store, bought snacks and drinks. They came back out at 9:23 and got in their car. Then what? That's where it gets strange. The cameras show the car leaving the lot, but then nothing. It's like they just drove into a black hole." Margaret examined the Honda, noting the child's safety seats and the small suitcase still in the trunk. Whatever had happened to Jennifer Walsh and her daughters, they hadn't been planning to abandon their vehicle or their belongings. The security footage from the truck stop told a story that chilled Margaret to the bone. The family had appeared normal, relaxed, with no indication they were being followed or threatened. But something had happened in the 8 minutes between leaving the truck stop and arriving at wherever they'd been taken. "How many roads lead away from here?" Margaret asked the local sheriff. "Dozens. This is a major interchange. You can get to Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Cumberland, or head south into Maryland. Perfect place to disappear someone." Margaret felt the weight of 20 years of unsolved cases pressing down on her. Somewhere in the darkness of the Pennsylvania Millfield, a killer who had perfected his methods over 2 decades had claimed new victims, but this time the trail was only hours old. The search for Jennifer Walsh and her daughters consumed the next 48 hours. Helicopters scoured the mountainous terrain while ground teams checked every abandoned building, mine shaft, and remote cabin within a 50-mile radius of Breezewood. The Pennsylvania State Police had mobilized their largest search operation in years, but the vast wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains seemed to swallow leads as quickly as they developed them. Margaret barely slept, surviving on coffee and the grim determination that had driven her through the darkest cases of her career. The command post at Breezewood had become a nerve center of activity, with agents and detectives coordinating search patterns and following up on hundreds of tips called in by concerned citizens. On the second day, a break came from an unexpected source. "Detective Chen?" The voice belonged to Eddie Kowalski, a 17-year-old whose father operated a small garage near the town of Bedford. "My dad said I should call about the missing family. I think I saw their car." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "When and where?" "Night before last, around 10 o'clock. I was coming home from my girlfriend's house, taking the back road through Miller's Hollow. There was a blue Honda parked at the old Kazinski place, but the weird thing was, there were 2 cars there. The name hit Margaret like a lightning bolt. Kazinski? You know the family? Not really. Old Vincent used to live there, but he moved out a few weeks ago. Place has been empty since then. But that night, there was the Honda and this big pickup truck. Margaret was already signaling to Agent Reeves as she continued the call. Eddie, this is very important. Did you see any people? Yeah, that's the strange part. There was this guy loading something into the back of the pickup. Something heavy, like maybe bags or, I don't know, it was dark. But he was being real careful with whatever it was. Can you describe the man? Medium height, wearing work clothes. I couldn't see his face, but something about him seemed, I don't know, wrong somehow. Made me drive faster. Within an hour, a convoy of law enforcement vehicles was racing toward Miller's Hollow, a remote valley 20 miles southeast of Breezewood, where Vincent Kazinski had maintained a small property he'd inherited from his father. The house sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by 50 acres of wooded land that provided perfect isolation for whatever activities had taken place there. The house was empty, but the evidence of recent occupation was everywhere. In the basement they found zip ties, rolls of heavy plastic sheeting, and industrial cleaning supplies. But most chilling of all was a room that had been converted into what could only be described as a trophy gallery. Photographs covered every wall. Surveillance photos of families at gas stations, rest stops and hotels. License plate numbers, travel schedules and detailed notes about daily routines. Vincent Kazinski hadn't just been hunting random victims, he'd been stalking specific families for weeks or months before striking. Margaret studied the photographs with growing horror. She recognized several faces from missing persons reports, families that had disappeared years earlier and never been found. But in the center of the room, pinned to a corkboard like a prized possession, were recent surveillance photos of Jennifer Walsh and her 2 daughters. Agent Reeves found Margaret staring at the wall, her face pale in the harsh light of the portable work lamps. Margaret, you need to see this. He led her to a desk where Kazinski had kept what appeared to be a detailed journal of his activities. The entries were written in a neat, precise handwriting that somehow made their content even more disturbing. November 15, 1985. Walsh family identified. Travel pattern confirmed. Children age appropriate. Proceed with phase 2. November 17, 1985. Acquisition complete. Transport to Site 7 initiated. November 18, 1985. Processing complete. Collection status active. Margaret felt sick as she realized what Site 7 meant. Somewhere in the Pennsylvania wilderness, Vincent Kazinski had 7 different locations where he disposed of his victims. The Millfield site had been just one stop on a tour of horrors that spanned hundreds of square miles. But the journal's final entry, dated just 12 hours earlier, contained information that sent the task force into overdrive. November 19, 1985. Law enforcement activity detected. Initiate Protocol 7. New hunting grounds required. Consider Carolina Highlands or Tennessee Valley systems. Vincent Kazinski was still out there, still active, and according to his own notes, he was already scouting new territories where he could continue his deadly work. The race to stop him had become a race against time, with the lives of countless future victims hanging in the balance. As Margaret stood in that basement gallery of horror surrounded by the evidence of 20 years of systematic murder, she realized that catching Vincent Kazinski would require more than traditional police work. They were hunting a predator who had spent decades perfecting his methods, someone who understood law enforcement procedures well enough to stay ahead of every investigation. The question that would haunt her through the sleepless nights ahead was whether they could catch him before he disappeared into a new hunting ground, leaving behind only the monuments to his crimes scattered across the mountains of Pennsylvania. The manhunt for Vincent Kazinski began at dawn on November 20, 1985, with the largest coordinated law enforcement operation in Pennsylvania history. From her position in the Mobile Command Center, Detective Margaret Chen watched as helicopters lifted off from a makeshift landing zone, their rotors cutting through the morning mist that clung to the Allegheny Mountains like shrouds. But the trail had already gone cold. Kazinski's pickup truck had been found abandoned at a rest stop near the Maryland border, its cargo bed scrubbed clean with industrial bleach. Security cameras had captured him transferring items to a different vehicle, a stolen van that had disappeared into the labyrinth of backroads that connected the rural communities of Appalachia. "He's had this plan for months," Agent Reeves said, studying the tactical map spread across the command table. Every move calculated, every contingency prepared for. Margaret stared at the photographs of Jennifer Walsh and her daughters, Emma, age 7, and Sophie, age 4, that had been pinned to the bulletin board. Somewhere in the vast wilderness of 3 states, those children were either already dead or living through horrors no child should experience. The weight of that knowledge pressed against her chest like a physical force. Dr. Rebecca Norton approached with a psychological profile that had taken her team 48 hours to compile. "Kazinski isn't running randomly," she announced to the assembled investigators. "His journal entries suggest he has predetermined safe houses, probably locations he's been preparing for years." "Based on what?" Margaret asked. "The mining background. Look at his employment history. He's worked for companies with operations in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, and Maryland. Always in remote areas, always with access to abandoned infrastructure." Dr. Norton pointed to clusters of red pins on the map. "He's not just hiding. He's returning to territory he knows better than we do." The radio crackled with an update from the search teams. "Command, this is Team 7. We've got something at the old Sterling Mine site." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. The Sterling Mine had been abandoned since 1971, its entrance sealed with concrete barriers that had long since cracked and crumbled. If Kazinski was using abandoned mines as hiding places, they'd need specialized equipment and cave rescue teams to pursue him. The helicopter ride to Sterling Mine took 12 minutes, following ridgelines that offered glimpses of the vast forest canopy stretching to the horizon. From the air, Margaret could see why Kazinski had chosen this territory. Thousands of square miles of uninhabited wilderness, dotted with the scars of old mining operations and connected by forgotten roads that appeared on no modern maps. Team 7 had discovered fresh tire tracks leading to the mine entrance, along with evidence that someone had recently removed the concrete barriers. But more chilling was what they'd found just inside the tunnel. Personal belongings that matched the descriptions of items missing from the Walsh family's car. "He's down there," Margaret said, more to herself than to the assembled team. "The question is whether he still has hostages." Special Agent Tom Martinez from the FBI's hostage rescue team studied the mine entrance through binoculars. "If he's taken them underground, we're looking at a tactical nightmare. Limited access, unknown layout, potential for cave-ins or booby traps." Margaret made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. "I'm going in first. Alone." "Absolutely not," Agent Reeves protested. "This isn't a solo operation. It has to be." Margaret checked her service weapon and adjusted her flashlight. "Kazinski has been one step ahead of us for 20 years, because he thinks like a hunter. But hunters can be spooked. If he sees a tactical team, he'll kill any hostages immediately. One person, moving carefully, that's our only chance." The mine entrance yawned before her like the mouth of some primordial beast, its depths swallowing her flashlight beam within 20 feet. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay and something else, the distinctive odor of industrial chemicals that had become associated with Vincent Kazinski's crimes. Margaret moved through the tunnel with the measured pace of someone who understood that every step could trigger a trap or alert a killer to her presence. The mine shaft branched into multiple passages, but fresh footprints in the dust made the path clear. Someone had been using this place regularly, and recently. The sound reached her first, a child's voice, weak and frightened, echoing from somewhere deep in the mountain. Margaret's training warred with her maternal instincts, as she forced herself to continue moving slowly, methodically toward the source of the sound. The chamber Vincent Kazinski had converted into his private hell existed in a natural cavern about 300 feet from the mine entrance. When Margaret's flashlight beam first illuminated the space, her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Industrial containers lined the walls, like metal coffins, each one labeled with dates going back nearly 20 years. But in the center of the chamber, secured to metal chairs with zip ties, were Jennifer Walsh and her two daughters. They were alive. Jennifer's eyes widened when she saw Margaret, hope and terror fighting for dominance in her expression. The children appeared to be sedated, their heads lolling forward in an unnatural sleep that suggested they'd been drugged to keep them quiet. Margaret approached carefully, her weapon drawn, but pointed downward to avoid triggering panic. "Mrs. Walsh, I'm Detective Chen with the Pennsylvania State Police. We're here to get you out." He's coming back," Jennifer whispered through lips cracked from dehydration. "He said he had to get supplies. He's been planning something." Margaret began cutting the zip ties that bound Jennifer's wrists, her mind racing through tactical considerations. Kazinski could return at any moment, and the narrow mine tunnels would turn into a death trap if he decided to make a stand. "How long ago did he leave?" "I don't know. Hours, maybe. He showed us pictures." Jennifer's voice broke. "Pictures of other families. He said we were going to join his collection." Margaret had freed Jennifer and was working on the restraints holding the younger daughter when the lights went out. Not just her flashlight, every source of illumination in the chamber died simultaneously, plunging them into absolute darkness. The mechanical hum of what she now realized had been a generator faded to silence, leaving only the sound of dripping water and Jennifer Walsh's terrified breathing. "He's back," Jennifer whispered. Margaret clicked her radio, but received only static. They were too deep underground for communication with the surface team. Whatever happened next, she was on her own with 3 civilians and a killer who knew every inch of these tunnels. The voice, when it came, seemed to emerge from the darkness itself. "Detective Chen." Vincent Kazinski's words echoed through the cavern with the confidence of someone completely in control. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." Margaret positioned herself between the Walsh family and the direction of the voice, her weapon trained on shadows she couldn't see. "Vincent, you don't have to do this. Let the family go, and we can talk." His laughter was the sound of sanity fracturing. "Talk? About what?" "About the 23 families I've collected over the years. About the beauty of preservation, of creating something permanent in a world of decay." Margaret heard movement in the darkness, the scrape of boots on stone, the metallic click of what might have been a weapon being readied. Kazinski was circling them, using his knowledge of the chamber to stay invisible while closing distance. "I know about your collection, Vincent. I've seen the photographs, read your journals. You're an artist, aren't you? Someone who creates beauty from chaos. Finally, someone who understands." His voice was closer now, maybe 20 feet away. "The families were perfect when I found them, complete, innocent, traveling through this ugly world without appreciation for their own mortality. I gave them permanence." Margaret felt Jennifer Walsh pressing against her back, still clutching her drugged daughters. The only way out was through Vincent Kazinski, and he held every advantage except one. He wanted to talk, to share his philosophy with someone who might appreciate his work. "Show me," Margaret said. "Show me what you've created." The lights came back on suddenly, flooding the chamber with harsh illumination that made Margaret squint and temporarily ruined her night vision. When her eyes adjusted, she found herself staring at Vincent Kazinski from a distance of 10 feet. He looked exactly like his photograph. Unremarkable features, thinning hair, work clothes that could belong to any blue-collar worker in Pennsylvania. But his eyes held the flat emptiness that Margaret had learned to recognize in predators, the complete absence of empathy that allowed them to view other human beings as objects. In his hands was a shotgun. 23 families, he said, conversationally, as if discussing the weather. preserved perfectly, catalogued, maintained. My life's work. Margaret kept her service weapon trained on his center mass, but knew she was at a tactical disadvantage. At this range, even a dying man could trigger a shotgun blast that would kill everyone in the chamber. "Why families?" she asked, buying time and hoping the surface team would find a way to reach them. "Because families are complete stories, beginning, middle, end. Parents protecting children, children trusting parents. It's the most beautiful lie humanity tells itself." His finger tightened on the trigger. "I preserve the truth underneath." The confrontation that followed lasted less than 30 seconds, but would replay in Margaret's mind for the rest of her career. She fired twice. Both rounds struck Kazinski's center mass, the impact spinning him around and sending the shotgun clattering across the stone floor. But even as he fell, his hand was reaching for a pistol at his belt, a backup weapon that Margaret hadn't seen in the harsh lighting. The third shot was the one that ended Vincent Kazinski's 20-year reign of terror, a final bullet that silenced forever the voice that had whispered death to so many families. In the sudden quiet that followed, Margaret heard sounds she would treasure for the rest of her life: Jennifer Walsh crying with relief, and the distant shouts of the rescue team that had finally found their way through the maze of mine tunnels. But as Margaret knelt beside Kazinski's body, checking for any signs of life, she found something that would ensure his crimes would haunt investigators for years to come. Clutched in his hand was a folded piece of paper covered with locations and dates. Not past crimes, but future ones. A detailed plan for continuing his work in the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee, complete with target families he'd already identified and stalked. Vincent Kazinski hadn't been planning to stop. He'd been planning to expand. The rescue of the Walsh family made national news, but Margaret found little satisfaction in the media attention that followed. Jennifer and her daughters recovered physically from their ordeal, though the psychological scars would take years to heal. The family eventually relocated to California, seeking distance from the Pennsylvania mountains that had nearly become their tomb. The final tally of Vincent Kazinski's crimes was staggering. 27 families murdered over a period of 22 years, with remains found at 11 different sites across 4 states. The investigation, which continued for another 6 months, recovered evidence that brought closure to dozens of missing persons cases that had haunted law enforcement agencies throughout the region. But for Margaret, the true end of the case came on a cold morning in March 1986, when she stood at the edge of the Millfield site watching as the last of the victim recovery operations concluded. The Pennsylvania mountains had finally given up their secrets, and the families whose disappearances had mystified police for decades could finally be laid to rest. Dr. Emily Hartman approached with the final coroner's report, a thick folder that contained the official conclusion to one of Pennsylvania's most complex criminal investigations. 53 victims in total, she said quietly, the oldest dating back to 1963, the youngest just 4 months old when she died. Margaret accepted the report but didn't open it immediately. She'd seen enough crime scene photographs and autopsy results to last several lifetimes. What mattered now was that the killing had stopped, and that future families traveling the highways of Pennsylvania wouldn't disappear into the mountains to become part of someone's twisted collection. "There's something else," Dr. Hartman continued. "We found evidence that Kazinski wasn't working alone, at least not in the early years. Some of the crime scenes show signatures of 2 different killers." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You're saying there might be another killer out there? Or was?" "The pattern changes significantly after 1975. Either the partner died, or they had a falling out." Dr. Hartman paused, studying Margaret's expression. "It's possible we'll never know for certain." As Margaret drove away from Millfield for the final time, she reflected on the nature of justice and closure. Vincent Kazinski was dead. His victims had been identified and recovered, and the families who had waited years for answers finally had them. But in the complex mathematics of criminal investigation, Some equations could never be fully solved. Somewhere in the files of unsolved missing persons cases, there might be other families who had encountered Vincent Kazinski's unknown partner, other children who had trusted the wrong stranger, other parents who had stopped for gas at the wrong service station. The Pennsylvania mountains had kept their secrets for over 20 years before finally yielding to the persistence of investigators and the determination of families who refused to stop searching for their missing loved ones. But mountains were patient, and darkness was deep, and Margaret suspected that not all of their secrets had been revealed. As she drove through the small town of Somerset, past the Pine Valley Motor Lodge, where she'd spent so many sleepless nights during the investigation, Margaret made a promise to herself and to the families whose stories had become her obsession. She would keep watching, keep investigating, keep fighting against the darkness that created monsters like Vincent Kazinski and allowed them to operate in the shadows for decades. Because somewhere out there in the vast network of highways and forgotten places that connected America's small towns and rural communities, there were other predators, other collectors, other families traveling through the night, unaware that they were being watched, catalogued, and selected. The case of the Millfield murders was closed, but Margaret Chen's war against the monsters who preyed on innocent families was just beginning. In the end, justice was not a destination but a journey, one that required eternal vigilance and the recognition that evil never truly rested, only waited for the next opportunity to emerge from the shadows and claim new victims. The Pennsylvania mountains stood silent once again, their secrets finally told, their dead finally at peace. But in the darkness between the trees, other shadows stirred, and other stories waited to be discovered by those brave enough to seek the truth, no matter how terrible it might be. Detective Margaret Chen would go on to lead Pennsylvania's first cold case task force, solving dozens of missing persons cases over the next decade. The Millfield investigation changed how law enforcement agencies shared information across state lines and led to the creation of the first national database for tracking missing families. Vincent Kazinski's name became synonymous with methodical evil, but his crimes also demonstrated the power of persistence, cooperation, and the refusal to let the disappeared be forgotten. The Walsh family recovered from their ordeal and became advocates for missing persons cases. Jennifer Walsh would later establish a foundation that provided support for families of missing persons and funded advanced forensic techniques that helped solve cold cases across the country. As for the possibility of other killers still at large, that question would haunt investigators for years to come and serve as a reminder that the price of safety is eternal vigilance against those who would prey upon the innocent.